Magic items. They're honestly the most exciting bit of loot to get in D&D, at least for me. There's something about getting a new frosted axe, glimmering robe, winged pair of boots, or whatever else I come across that makes me look forward to what I'm going to be able to do next with my character and how they play. Magic items can have a very large impact on game balance and player character power level. We oftentimes see stories on Reddit or wherever else of powerful player builds where a specific magic item in tandem with the PC makes a game very difficult to balance. But it doesn't need to be these specific magic items. Even the simplest magic items, the plus 1, 2, and 3 weapons, can have an incredibly large impact on PC performance. Plus 1 weapons are strong, but how strong their effects are is not exactly easy to understand at a glance. While the answer to this question does depend on many factors, some of which are not easy to numerically quantify, the math fortunately does revolve around just one number: the expected damage. Expected damage is the damage number we can expect to get out of our weapon attacks over the course of taking many weapon attacks, once we factor in misses and any additional source of damage, like our strength modifier or critical hits. For a simplified example of expected damage, if we deal 6 damage whenever we hit with a weapon attack, but we only hit 50% of the time, our expected damage as we attack over and over and over is 50% times 6, or 3. The simple formula for expected damage is a result of two factors: hit rate and average damage, where hit rate is the percent to hit any given attack roll, and average damage is the average damage done by each attack. Quick side note, the formula I'm going to be using behind the scenes actually looks a little bit more complicated and pulls out 5 from the hit rate and moves it over here to account for critical hits. But the overall principle is still the same. The reason our question is not so easy to answer is because both factors are dependent on a long list of their own sub-factors. This analysis is mostly for low-level play, so we can actually control some of these factors like ability scores or armor class for monsters, but because there are still a few variables present, we're going to be looking more for guidelines that tell us generally how good these weapons are rather than specific values. Most monsters lower level PCs will fight typically have an AC somewhere between 11 and 15, so we can test the expected damage of a standard longsword against these AC values, then compare those results to the results for all of our magical swords. We can find our hit rate by subtracting our to hit modifier from the AC value of whatever creature, to find the minimum value we need to roll to hit. So if we use 11 AC for example, we hit on a 6 or greater, which means we land a hit on 15 out of 20 numbers, because we need higher than 5. 15 divided by 20 is 75%, so we have a 75% chance to hit on each attack given that the monster has 11 AC. Because the number we need to roll to hit increases by 1 each time the AC increases, we lose 5% hit rate with each AC increase. Our average damage is a result of the average damage done by our damage dice of whatever weapon we're using, plus our ability score modifier. We find the average damage of the damage die by adding up all the numbers on the die and dividing by the number of faces. For example, if we're using 1d4, we add up 1 through 4 for a total of 10, then divide by 4 for 2.5. You can see each of the average damages for all the dice here, but we're only concerned with 1d8 for the moment. The average for 1d8 is 4.5. And our ability score modifier is 3, so our average damage comes out to 7.5 for a one-handed longsword attack. Now, to find our expected damage, we take our average damage and multiply it by each of our 5 hit rates to get these values. Now, to factor in our magical swords, we just need to add in 1, 2, and 3 to the average damage, and 5, 10, and 15% to each of our hit rates. Okay, but what exactly is going on here? This is exactly what we expected. A damage increase somewhere in the neighborhood of 1, 2, or 3, depending on which sword we're looking at. So why exactly is a plus 1 weapon so strong? Well, let's look at these numbers in a slightly different lens. If we take the differences between each of the magical sword expected damages and the standard sword expected damages, we can then divide that by the standard sword expected damage to find the damage buff as a percent. When we look at the numbers, it becomes much more readily apparent why these weapons are so strong despite being otherwise mundane and straightforward. A plus 1 sword gives at least a 20% damage buff, while a plus 3 sword gives almost a 70% damage buff in its least effective case. But looking at these numbers, another question naturally comes up. If they're all receiving a +1 to attack and damage rolls, why aren't all the buffs the same depending on the AC value? A common misconception is that because we roll on a 20-sided die for attacking, then +1 adds 5% to the hit rate, which then means that our expected damage must also increase by 5%. Only the first half of that statement is true. To explain why, let's back away from rates and percentages and use an analogy which will hopefully explain this a little bit more easily. Imagine instead of fighting a fictional monster, you're trading blows with the real one, your boss. Instead of having a really high armor class, this monster instead just doesn't pay you that much. So at the end of the month, you're only left with $10 after you take out taxes and all your bills and such. But right after payday, you walk outside and you find $5 on the ground. Awesome. Now you have 1.5 times the money that you had before, or 50% more money. Now imagine you get a bonus that month, so you walk out with $50 instead of $10. You also find $5. It's still nice, but you only have 1.1 times the money now, or 10% more, despite finding the exact same amount. And it's not nearly as impactful as before when you had less money to begin with. If we have a lower hit rate to begin with as well, this principle still applies. If we have that lower hit rate, when we essentially find 5% more hit rate through our +1, it's very impactful on the end result. But if we have a higher hit rate, finding 5% doesn't make as much of a difference. This is why we see the damage buff increase as AC gets higher. We're making a larger difference on the hit rate side of the expected damage formula. In cases where hitting is more difficult, the effects of these weapons become stronger, making them particularly good at making sure your character has at least somewhat of a chance when you would otherwise need to get much luckier in an encounter. Additionally, it's not like these accuracy buffs exist in a vacuum either. More hits means more sneak attacks, more hunter's marks, more rage damage, and more weapon mastery effects. +1 weapons upgrade all features, which include needing to hit your target, which for the martial classes who want to use these weapons, that's quite a lot of them. As a DM giving out loot, keep in mind that as players level up and their ability scores and proficiency bonuses increase, the bonus from these weapons becomes slightly less impactful, but only slightly. If we simulate putting the +3 longsword in the hands of a level 10 character with +5 strength and a +9 to hit, the expected damage buff actually drops from between 68 and 78% to 54 and 62%, even though I also increase the AC of the enemies to be more level appropriate. As a general rule, the bonuses from these weapons should be less than a character's proficiency bonus, so that the damage buff remains mostly reasonable for their level. But keep in mind that even with this, it's still going to be a 20, 40, 60% damage buff for your player, so be careful about handing them out too early. And that's really about it. Even though these weapons seem mundane as far as magic weapons go, their potency will certainly affect your encounters both as a player and a DM. These weapons can almost always fit into a build, but that also makes them uninteresting when they are the most dominant option. For my fellow DMs out there, if your player already has a plus whatever weapon, and you want to give them more loot, but you want to make sure there's a choice involved, give them a weapon from the tier below and add on some sort of fun effect. Maybe one that fits into their build or something that their character would really like. Now that you have a more mathematical understanding of these weapons, I hope you are better equipped to give out loot as a DM or make choices as a player, and you can worry less about harming your game balance or making the worst choices and continue to have fun telling stories and making characters that you enjoy playing. And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something. I'm going to try to be making a few more videos like this. Thank you. Have a good one.